Alright, hey everybody, and welcome to this video. My name is Slither, and I've got a new microphone, so hopefully it sounds better than previous videos. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. We're going to go through a pose tutorial. You might have heard about pose in previous videos. You might even have tested out pose. You might be using pose right now. For those of you who aren't or aren't familiar with it, pose is like an advanced emote. It allows you to do more complex things and for you, the player, to see the actions you're writing for your character in the first person, while others will see it in the third person, or potentially the first person for them. So on the right-hand side, I've got my admin bit. On the left-hand side, I've got Joe Baca. So you'll see if I type look. There's Joe Baca gliding along. So my admin bit is sitting in the same room as Joe Baca. And we're going to see some of the things that Joe Baca says. So as you can see, when I type something on one side, it happens on the other. That is how the game works. So I do have command echoing on for Joe Baca, so you can see if I type something, emote looks around. You'll see I'm using localized speech. Let me just move that over a little bit. Joe Baca looks around, and Joe Baca looks around. Now, if I were to look at Feng Shui with an emote, I'd do emote looks at Feng Shui. And I see Joe Baca looks at Feng Shui on the left, and on the right, I see Joe Baca looks at Feng Shui, even though this side, it is Feng Shui who's seeing it. So he's seeing it in the third person, even though it's referring to him specifically. And that's sort of the downside of emote. The other thing is, you can imagine a situation where Joe Baca thinks he's all alone in a room with Feng Shui, a scary thought. And he writes something like this: emote looks at you. Now, first of all, on the left, it looks weird. I'm seeing Joe Baca looks at you. On the right, I'm also seeing Joe Baca looks at you, which looks correct. But imagine if there was a hidden person in this room. That person would think that Joe Baca was looking at them, because the moo is not doing anything special. It's just rendering the text as you've written it. And emote really helps. So first of all, don't do that, because you'll if you did something like emote punches you in the eye, some hidden person might think they were getting punched. Also, don't metagame punching people if you can help it. So pose solves a lot of these problems. Another problem that emote has is that if Joe Baca is not addressing Feng Shui, then it's possible that when Joe Baca does emote grins at Feng Shui and says, "Hey, brah." It's possible, because of the way that monitoring and watching works, which you can find out about in another video or with help speaking, Feng Shui won't be automatically matched. So if I go over here and I go to watching, it says I'm not watching anyone. If I type addressing, it says I'm only addressing Rycheck. And the reason for that is that if I type to Rycheck and I say something to Rycheck, it will automatically address them. So I don't have to type address Rycheck, because simply typing to Rycheck, hey, automatically addresses them. Now, using Feng Shui's name in an emote does not automatically cause me to address them, which means in a crowded bar, Feng Shui might not hear what I'm saying, especially if Feng Shui wasn't watching me specifically. So this is something to take into account because you only have a limited number of people you can watch, and if you're in a large room and you're not addressing everyone, or you're only addressing certain people, then it's possible that others don't hear you. So that's another issue with emote. You can use someone's name in an emote and it will not automatically address them. Pose solves that problem as well. So let's take a look. If I were to write .look, let's just convert the thing that I wrote to Feng Shui into a pose. So instead of emote grins, I'm going to write .grin. So you write emotes from the first person. So I'm going to .grin at Feng Shui and .say. So any words that you want to be converted from first person to third person, i.e. words that need an S, like says when Feng Shui sees it, should have a dot or a period prefixed before them, right? So the command is dot. You can also write pose grin at Feng Shui, but dot is shorthand, and I recommend just using dot. You don't need to use pose. So dot grin at Feng Shui and say, and dot say, hey brah. So around on this side, I will do that, and it says you grin at Feng Shui and say, hey brah. So it looks like the dot is being replaced with you, and the grin shows up as just grin for me, and the say shows up as just say for me. But on this side, you can see, on the right side, you can see that Joe Baca grins at you and says, hey brah. Now, if we were to go back over here and type addressing, you can see that I've automatically started addressing Feng Shui. And this is incredibly important because Pose has now saved you the time of having to manually address Feng Shui. And you're ensured that Feng Shui will see what you're saying when you include their name in a pose, especially a directed pose like that. Another thing that's really cool is that I'm sure all of you know that you can talk to an NPC, especially someone like Rycheck, and they will do things like you can order a drink. So if I were to say to Rycheck, beer me, bakalaka, he charges me for a beer. But what if I used his name in a pose instead? And I said, dot wave Rycheck over and dot say, beer me, bakalaka. You'll notice that that also worked. So directing speech at NPCs via pose can also cause automatic commands to be executed. The other thing that it will do is if you use an NPC's name in a pose, it'll also notify GMs if that NPC is not being puppeted. It will notify GMs that you are attempting to talk to them, or talk to that NPC, the same as if you used to talk directly to them. One thing to be careful about this is if you use an NPC's name multiple times, things like that, or if you use multiple NPC's names, you could potentially trigger multiple commands, things like that. So poses can be very complex, right? But there are some limitations. If I type dot look at Feng Shui, hey brah, before sitting down and continuing, sup, and then leaning back and saying, how you, boo? No, we're not gonna, don't use those. Don't use abbreviations. How you? On the left-hand side, it looks perfectly correct. You look at Feng Shui, hey brah, before sitting down and continuing, sup, and then leaning back and saying, how you? On the right-hand side, however, it's incorrect. Joe Baca looks at you, hey brah, before sitting down and continuing, sup, and then leaning back and saying, sup. Poses cannot contain more than 2 quoted strings before they start just repeating the second thing. So don't include more than 2. Also, as a rule of thumb, you want to keep your emotes and poses brief and to the point. It's okay. If you want to write longer ones, certainly do it, depending upon the roleplay. But if you're in an action-packed scene with a lot going on, people aren't going to be as interested in waiting for you to write out a 6-line pose. It's better to just include your actions and what your character is doing in each line of dialogue. So for a long time, the way that I made myself use pose was I just never used to. And whenever I found myself using to, which I think is very bland, hi, I would see, okay, I just wrote to Rycheck hi. I'm going to rewrite it as a pose. Dot look at Rycheck and smile. Hi. And I just made myself do that for every single piece of communication. Then dot lean against the bar and dot nod to feng shui. Yep. Like that. So you'll notice that I'm sure you've seen someone pose and seen something like this. Joe Baca leansies against the bar and nods to you. That leansies is basically an indication that they put a dot in front of a word that already had an S at the end. So they did it by accident. Perhaps because they're used to writing emotes, and in an emote you would write emote leans, but they've used pose. So when you're writing your emotes, remember that you're writing them from the first person. So dot lean against the bar and dot nod to feng shui. The other thing to keep in mind is shrouded people. When you are addressing a shrouded person in an emote, you should only include one of their aliases. So if there's a shrouded short man, you could address them as dot look at man, or dot look at shrouded, or dot look at short. But if you included a shrouded short man, then what will happen, obviously there's no shrouded short man here, so that looked fine, but if you did do it, it would actually take each one of those aliases and include the full name for each one of them. So it'd be like dot look at a shrouded short man, a shrouded short man, a shrouded short man, a shrouded short man, period. It'd be very confusing. If there are multiple shrouded people in the room, it can be even more complicated. I recommend you just kind of practice when that happens. Don't be afraid to ask on out of character if your pose showed up correctly. Hey, did that pose look weird? Is totally acceptable. Now, you don't want to do this all the time, and it's best not to do it in a crowded bar, but if you're role-playing in a small scene with someone, I wouldn't think that there's anything wrong with simply asking if your poses are looking correctly. The other thing you can do is we have a specific tutorial. So you type @tutorial, and you can go to communication using emote, and here we are, and there is a security monitor in this emote tutorial. Dot look around, and you will see your pose on that security monitor. You can also do emote looks around. Dance. Dot look at monitor and dot frown at how much of a baka I is. So you'll also notice that I wrote that in an interesting way. So let's finish this tutorial. So let's say I do dot look at monitor and dot frown at how much of a baka I is. That looks correct from the third person. Joe Baca looks at a monitor and frowns at how much of a baka he is. Now, if you wrote I am, it will show up weird. So pose does want first person writing, but when it comes to is and am, it gets a little confused. So I recommend that you write your sorry, my cat has joined me. No, you stay away. That's a microphone. I recommend you write your poses from the first person, because you need to, but also be aware of is and am. So it's almost like you want to write the pose as if you were 7X. Because he'd be like, Motherfucker, you ain't is got a clue how crazy I is. Or something like that, right? He's not going to use the word am. And pose doesn't use the word am either. So think like a mixer when it comes to is and am with regards to pose. You can include multiple people's names in a pose. Like dot look around and dot wave at everyone. Or dot wave at Feng Shui and Rycheck. And it will show up correctly for both of them. It will show up as Joe Baca looks around and waves at you and Rycheck for Feng Shui, and it will show up as Joe Baca looks around and waves at Feng Shui and you for Rycheck, and it will show up as you look around and wave at Feng Shui and Rycheck for Joe Baca. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If so, please make sure to like it. Feel free to subscribe to this channel where I post numerous videos on how to play Sindome and other things, how to roleplay, things like that. And be sure that if you find somebody in-game that is having trouble with this, you send them the link to this video, because it's very helpful. Thanks a lot, and good luck.